Today is May 26, 1985, and that means that it's time for the Indianapolis 500 to run yet again. And of course, if it's the Indianapolis 500, that means that there are going to be a lot of race cars, and of course, there will also be a pace car. Now, many vehicles have served as the Indy 500 pace car over the years, including Dodge Vipers and Chevrolet Corvettes, various sporty vehicles, shall we say. But this is going to be an interesting tale of a very strange pace car for 1985. It was actually driven by James Gardner, who you see here. And that's because the 1985 Indianapolis 500 pace car was an Oldsmobile. Now you may say, well, Oldsmobile has done other pace cars by this point in 1985, but the key thing about the 1985 Oldsmobile pace car was that it was a car that I would say no one would expect to find as the pace car for the Indianapolis 500, and that's because the pace car for 1985 was an all-new Oldsmobile Calais custom-made convertible. Yes, I did say that right. The Oldsmobile Calais, which is about the least sporty vehicle in the Oldsmobile lineup, served as the pace car for the 1985 Indianapolis 500, and you can see a picture of the real one here at the race. Now, an Olds Calais, you say, well, what in the world is that doing as a pace car for the Indianapolis 500? Well, let's remember the time and place in which this took place. And in 1985, the Oldsmobile Calais was a newly introduced vehicle in the Olds lineup, and it was introduced at the same time as the Pontiac Grand Am as well as the Buick Somerset, and rode atop GM's all-new N-Car platform. Now, the N-Car platform was really the replacement for the X-Cars, the Chevrolet Citation, Pontiac Phoenix, Olds Omega, as well as Buick Skylark. By that point, the X-Cars had ran for a number of model years from 1980 through 1985, and it was time to replace them. They also didn't have the best reputation for quality, as perhaps best evidenced by the fact that Chevrolet tried to reintroduce the Citation later on in the model year cycle as the Citation 2 to denote that they had improved the quality, although even that point was relatively debatable. Nonetheless, for 1985, the new N-Car platform was really based in part on the J-Cars that were introduced in 1982, but the cars here rode atop a longer 103-plus inch wheelbase and were designed to be more spacious on the inside than the J-Cars were. And here we have and are going to talk about a particular pace car replica that you could buy through your Oldsmobile dealer back then. And you'll notice that this isn't a convertible. The convertible pace car was a one-off with quite a bit of unique content, including a 215 horsepower 2.7-liter variant of the GM Iron Duke engine under hood, which was, well, let's just say more than double what the stock engine was, the standard engine in the pace car, which was a 92 horsepower 2.5-liter Iron Duke four-cylinder. So the pace car replica, it's kind of humorous, the pace car replica that you could order through your GM dealer came standard with a 92 horsepower engine under hood. And bear in mind that pace cars had to be a little bit on the higher horsepower side during this time frame, because even during yellow flag events on the Indy 500, when the cars come out, the pace car has to travel between 80 and a little over 100 miles an hour. So that's, requires some power under hood, and there actually are acceleration requirements at that speed that the cars have to meet in order to qualify. So clearly a 92 horsepower engine was not going to enable this car to probably even push over 100 miles per hour, much less meet any acceleration requirements. But that's why Oldsmobile had to modify the Iron Duke for the use in the pace car. But if you just got the standard car that you see here, you didn't get any of those modifications. Now let's talk a little bit more about the design of the N-Car that you see here. And again, an all-new vehicle for 1985, all-new sheet metal, but unfortunately the N-Cars, and it didn't matter what variant you received or procured, whether it was the Olds, the Pontiac, or the Buick, They all had the very typical roofline for GM during that time frame, this vertical C-pillar, which was so in vogue at General Motors, designers had become enamored with the 1976 to 79 Cadillac Seville proportions and effectively used that roofline on almost everything that wasn't a non-sporty vehicle. So whether it was a J car, a C car, a N car, an H car, they all had an A car, I could say too, an X car. They all had a variant with a very formal like roofline. And for those who don't know all the GM platform nomenclatures, basically just assume that I listed off every front-wheel drive variant of vehicle that GM was producing in the 1980s, irrespective of the size. And you can see that C-pillar here, but you also have some other very typical GM styling trends during the time, and that includes this very low start to the hood and a rising hood line, which then the belt line is below the hood on the side. That was another very typical GM styling trait from the time. The other thing that you'll notice are the super clean body sides here. Interestingly, the body side here is devoid of any crease aside from the wheel arches and those particular forms. There's not any crease that runs across the entire car. There's really nothing, so to speak, of aside from that lower body molding and the cladding underneath it, the gray cladding. So very simple, very clean, and I have to say, I think it's a pretty good-looking car. These cars were well received by customers in terms of their style, despite the fact that GM designers, as I mentioned, kind of used the same roofline for everything during this time. As we transition to the side view, we continue to see that C-pillar I was mentioning, but you pick up another dimension here, and again, a somewhat typical styling trait for GM designers during that time, which was a very short backlight. You notice the vertical distance from the roofline, the top of the roof, to the bottom of the C-pillar is not very tall. In fact, look at how much larger the rear quarter glass is than that dimension that I just mentioned previously. And that's really because they wanted to have this kind of look of privacy to the backlight and in the back seat area on these vehicles. And as a consequence, the deck lid is relatively high, also helping the trunk volume. So it's an innovative way to get a good look and also meet the trunk volume criteria. And I have to say, despite the near ubiquitous roofline that this particular vehicle has with respect to GM cars or front-wheel drive cars of the period, there is some beautiful surfacing to that roofline. Look at how soft the transition is from the A-pillar into the roof and how the roof has this beautiful curvature up at the leading edge of the windshield. And then you'll notice the roof has this gentle downward sloping arc as it goes rearward on the car. So it's not just a flat roof. A lot of the Fords of this time, you can think of as an example, the Lincoln Town Car, the Mercury Marquis, the Ford LTD, Crown Vic, etc., had a very flat roof. And this roof doesn't have that. It's got some crown to it all the way around. So despite the fact that it's a very simple form, it does have some beauty as well. And as we transition to this rear kind of somewhat three-quarter view, notice the C-pillar also has a pretty typical trait, which is that it pulls inward at the bottom there away from the quarter panel to form that little shoulder. That was something that you'd see on a number of other GM cars, in particular some of the Cadillacs, as well as the E-cars like the Buick Riviera. You would see that type of a roofline as well. And out back, you have some pretty typical Oldsmobile-style tail lamps, although they are vertical here. Remember that the Cutlasses of the era had those vertical tail lamps that were quite distinctive. And here you have the same. Oldsmobile at this point was trying to make every car a Cutlass. The regular Cutlass Supreme, the Cutlass Salon, the Cutlass Sierra, the Cutlass Calais even, as Oldsmobile wanted. It's just, let's just say a Cutlass overload. And I think that they kept those vertical tail lamps with that bisection in the middle to tie in with the rear-wheel drive Cutlass and the way that it looked. Now, as we turn to the inside, this is where it gets a little funky. Take a look at these seats with the silver and red contrasting colors and leather seating areas on this particular vehicle, and the leather-wrapped steering wheel, the two-spoke Oldsmobile design that was unique to Oldsmobile that you see. I have to say, I think it's a pretty handsome interior. The dash is rather nice. Notice the instrument panel hood spills over into the controls on the left for the headlamps and the panel on the right for the wipers and the washer. You also have on the door panels a lot of soft touch materials up top that are surrounding the pull strap and that are in the silver material. The glove box as well as the instrument panel top pad are both finished in red, and then you have that kind of bright work in the middle in between them. I will say that I like how the hood over the instruments is not just square. And one of the good things about this radius hood over the gauges is that when you corner in the vehicle, it doesn't appear that the vehicle is pitching all that much because the radius is just kind of rotating with the car, and it's harder for your eye to discern versus if the top of that instrument panel top pad in that area were just, let's say, flat. Now, I will say the interior materials in some of these and the componentry that was used left something to be desired. The window regulators in these, the tape drive window regulators that GM used, were notorious for failing, particularly in winter months. And the windows always went up and down very slowly in 80s era GM cars with power windows. Then I also say one thing that's funky is that gear shift there in the center console, how tall it is. I always thought that was awkward, especially with respect to the height of the center console. I'm not sure why designers did that, and to some degree it interferes with some of the controls. Here's a better shot of the seating areas in this vehicle. Kind of a nice design overall. Clearly have some lateral support, which is starting to come into vogue during this particular time. The seat backs are rather thin, and the rear seat is rather upright to try to give those rear seat passengers a bit more area to stretch out back there. But these cars were pretty tight in coupe form. They obviously made Calais sedans as well. But I think the coupe was the looker of the four-door sedan and two-door coupe, as is usually the case. And if you didn't spot it in other pictures, notice what is at the bottom of the center stack there. That is the auto calculator, the so-called trip computer that was optional in these vehicles. And using that, you can see how far you've traveled, what your miles to empty are, an anticipated time at which you'll arrive at your destination based on the speed at which you'll travel. Those calculators really started coming out in the, I want to say 1978 or 79 Cadillac Seville had a trip computer. And this is kind of a copy of that. So it's a pretty expensive option. Some folks ordered it. I think that some of the features are a little bit gimmicky, but nonetheless, this was an era where people were infatuated and designers were infatuated with high tech. And you can also see that in the radio with all the little small buttons that are employed to turn it on, off, as well as effect change to the graphic equalizer. And now we come to the best part about this pace car, and that is the 92 horsepower Iron Duke 2.5 liter four-cylinder underhood. Now, the Iron Duke was engineered by Pontiac Motor Division, but by this point, it was becoming rather well used in everything from S10 pickups to Camaros and Firebirds. Yes, I said Camaros and Firebirds had this 92 horsepower engine standard. To the Calais that you see here, to the A-body cars like the Cutlass Sierra, the Celebrity, as well as the Pontiac 6000 and Buick Century. It just was being used by GM almost everywhere. And if you've been watching the channel for some time, you know that I kind of pick on this engine a little bit. And yes, it was quite reliable. It did have some challenges by this point. In the pre-1987 years, it did not have crank-triggered ignition, so this still has a distributor. And have fun changing the distributor cap and rotor because it's on the backside of the engine up near the firewall there. Can be done, and it's just not a fun job on these cars, I will say. And the engine makes a distinctive puttering noise. It was also the engine used in the Grumman LLV postal vehicles. So when those postal trucks kind of putter up to your house and you hear that, that's the sound of the Iron Duke and its dulcet tones. And I think Car and Driver humorously kind of picked on this engine because it was named the Tech 4. You can see the logo there on the air cleaner, but I think Car and Driver called it the Low Tech 4 because it had throttle body injection, didn't have multi-port injection. It was not overhead cam, just a pushrod overhead valve engine. Basically kind of tractor engine technology under hood except for the throttle body injection. I will say one great innovative feature that these engines have is the thermostat is very easy to replace. Notice the cap there. That's where you're supposed to fill the coolant, and you don't fill it on the radiator side. And if you want to change the thermostat, you just pull it right out. You take that cap off, pull the thermostat out, and replace it. It's maybe a 10-second job. Pretty awesome. Now, as I mentioned, these Iron Dukes were quite reliable. The really only Achilles heel that they have is that there is not a timing chain on these particular variants. It's just the crankshaft and the camshaft have gears that mesh directly together, and they're plastic. And so around 100, 120,000 miles, they tend to start shedding teeth, and maybe by 125, 130,000 miles, the teeth break off. And then the camshaft stops turning, and then bad things happen, which is unfortunate because the engine would probably continue on for much longer. And unfortunately, it's generally a engine out job to replace the camshaft because the gear is pressed on. Now, I have heard of people and mechanics of the era developing shortcuts in order to get the gear off while it's still in the car. And some of them certainly were able to do that, but that's a little bit more complicated procedure than I think the book called for in terms of this particular job. So what do you think of this particular pace car? And how would you like to own this 92 horsepower Malaise era pace car that I just mentioned? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.